Hello, I'm Adrian Ashton, and welcome to this video session about difficult conversations. Sometimes people refer to this as the elephant in the room, the thing that everyone sees is there. Everyone knows it's a huge problem, but nobody actually wants to talk about it. And there's probably various reasons why we try and avoid this, but the idea of this session is to introduce you to some ideas, some approaches, some frameworks, and some tools that will hopefully, if not make it easier, enable you to feel more confident and assured when you need to have those awkward chats with other people. So let's start by what we actually mean when we're talking about awkward conversations, difficult discussions. And they're usually to do with other people, if we're honest. If we think back to times that we've had conversations or people have talked to us and it's not felt very nice, we've been twitching in the chair, hoping the ground opens up and swallows us, it's because of something about people getting along or not getting along, as the case may be. Difficult conversations are usually about other people and the way they are working with others, about their attitude, how they're approaching work, how they're approaching tasks, how they're doing things, or how they're actually delivering on their job. Now, as trustees, it may be that from time to time you need to have difficult conversations with each other, or rather with one of your number, because it's not unknown that sometimes people struggle to be a trustee, to actually fulfill the practicalities of the task. You may find that some trustees always seem to be late, never seem to have read the papers, seem to miss more meetings than they turn up to. So you have to have a difficult conversation with them to say, look, are you really serious about being a trustee? Because your performance in the role to date is actually causing problems for the rest of us to be able to get on and do this. And that's awkward because we might like that person. So we try and avoid them. But we shouldn't avoid them because ultimately we all know why we need to do them, why we somehow have to push ourselves through and say, we're just going to somehow muddle through this, force our way through it. Hopefully, there won't be too much blood left on the carpet afterwards. Because we know that if we don't call these things out, if there's issues about how other people are acting, if there's a difficult decision even about, well, do we carry on working in partnership with this other organization? They're really popular, but it's not working out for us. What what's the worst that could happen? What if we just ignore it? Let's pretend everything's okay. It will go away by itself, because after all, that's the great British attitude, isn't it? Let's just hope it goes away by itself. It rarely does. Whatever the issue is that's prompted you to need to have a difficult conversation, if you don't resolve it, things will get worse. The smell will get worse, the big pile of poo will get bigger, more people will get upset. The way that you work together with each other as trustees, with paid staff, with volunteers, with partner organizations, all of that starts to erode. Because people say, well, look, if we're not prepared, if we're only prepared to do the fun, easy stuff, if we're not prepared or able to make the hard judgment calls, then how credible are you? How seriously should I take you? And that means that people stop engaging. Well, there's no point going to that meeting because nothing's going to happen. Things will just be allowed to carry on. That's the message that it gives out. And ultimately, what that means is the charity as a whole starts to break down. It stops being able to deliver on its purposes because people don't trust it, because people aren't turning up, because people don't feel things are being handled properly that need handling. Now, as part of the image on this slide deck that you'll see is a horseshoe. And some of you may be thinking, oh, what's the horseshoe about? Now, for those of you who are watching this and you know what the significance of this is, congratulations to you. I'll pause for a moment and then you can tell anyone you're watching, I know what it is. And then I'll pick up and confirm to them all that you are correct. Okay, so back again. The horseshoe is there because actually the most important thing in that image is the nail, the horseshoe nail, because there's a little ditty that goes back centuries now. And it's about doing things that seem small and insignificant and are a hassle and a faff. And actually, it's more difficult than it's worth. So the analogy goes that a blacksmith is shoeing a horse and he runs out of nails. So he's lost, he hasn't got enough nails. He wasn't properly prepared. And he wasn't prepared to have the difficult conversation with the rider to say, your horse is not ready. And the rider was not prepared to have the difficult conversation with his colleagues to say, we need to rethink this because my horse won't be ready to go. Because the ditty goes, for want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a cavalry was lost. For want of a cavalry, a battle was lost. For want of a battle, a war was lost. And for want of a war, a kingdom was lost. A kingdom was lost all for the want of a nail, for something small and insignificant and probably seemed more hassle than it was worth to call it out and to have a difficult conversation around. So these things can amplify quite quickly. But actually, let's be honest first, before we even think about how do we start to approach these things? What are the ways we do it? Well, actually, if we know what's stopping us, that can help us better work out how do we fix it. And I have an idea. There's probably 2 or 3 main reasons. There are probably many more than these, but for the purposes of this session, let's just pick these 3 for now. And the first is you don't think you're appropriately skilled or trained or experienced to do this difficult conversation because you're a trustee. You're there in a voluntary capacity. You're asked to join the board maybe because you were a really good bookkeeper, or you've lived in the area all your life, so you know you've got that lived experience, that important link. And then all of a sudden you're being asked to have a difficult conversation with a commissioner or the head of a grant-making trust or a volunteer who's been found to have their hand in the till or whatever it is. How are you qualified? Self-doubt kicks in. Imposter syndrome. Okay, well, you're there for a reason. We'll come back to this. The other reason as well is it may be actually be far more simple than that, far more basic. The other person may be bigger than us. We could feel intimidated by them because they've been in post longer than we have. They've got more qualifications than us. They're physically bigger than us. They are a more beautiful orator than we feel we are. So we feel intimidated. We're like, they're just going to shout us down. We're not going to be able to hold our ground, so we don't want to avoid it. And then finally, back to that imposter syndrome idea, what if I stuff it up? What if I get this wrong? And in trying to work through the difficult conversation, resolve the issue, I only managed to put my foot in it more and make everything 10 times worse. And that last one is actually probably quite a legitimate concern. Because if you don't handle difficult conversations well, they will get worse. The issue will explode further. And this is why we have this session, to help you feel more confident and structured in how you approach this. So a few ways to think about it. So before you even arrange the time to speak with this person or group of people, actually think about how you manage it. And the first point of call, and we've picked up on this in some of the other video sessions about governance, what it means to be a trustee in the governing documents, is about the policies and procedures. Check in the policies and procedures manuals and folders and files, because whatever the issue might be, if it's a grievance, if it's a disciplinary, there should already be a policy and procedure that's been checked and validated as to how you approach this. So you don't have to worry about how do I do this. It's already been set out for you. All you have to do is follow the instructions, follow the steps. Okay, that's brilliant. Next question to think about: should you do it by yourself or should you have someone with you? Well, this is, again, it's a difficult one to tell from where I'm sharing these ideas with you at this moment in time, because this is sort of November 2020. Not sure when or where you're watching this. But it may be that if it's kind of something you want to see if you can explore informally. So, for example, you're the chair, and a few of the other trustees have come to you and says, "Oh, Bob or Sylvia or whoever it is over there, a bit worried about their performance. They're always late. They never seem to know what's going on." So you as the chair have a quiet, informal conversation with them in the first instance. Don't make it a big formal thing. Let's just see if there might be a gentle chat might be sufficient to resolve it. So in which case, do it alone. Or if it's something more formal and serious, then maybe have someone with you to do with you. Next question is, how important is it that you keep a record of the discussion? Again, this will be determined by the policy, by the seriousness of the issue, by the potential fallout from it. But keeping a record of it could be quite important if there's challenges in the future. If you know one conversation will probably maybe not fix it entirely, if there may be future repercussions, because the other party is upset, not with you, but with how it's been handled or the decision that's come. So you need a record of that. So there's transparency, there's accountability. And that could be a written record. You could choose to record it if you're doing it over a video call. If it's a conversation in person, you could agree, both parties could agree that we'll just turn our phones on and use our voice recorders on our phones to record it that way. Of course, if you do record things like that, you need to make sure that those records, whatever format they're in, are kept securely and in accordance with appropriate data protection regulations and legislation. There's also a question about, where do you have this difficult conversation? Do you have it somewhere that's familiar to the charity? Somewhere where you might get distracted by the people coming through? Or do you have it somewhere neutral? Somewhere that you won't have distractions, somewhere that it isn't familiar, that you can be just focused on the issue that you're trying to resolve with the other person? And when does it happen? When do you arrange it? Is it first thing in the morning? Is it last thing at night? Sometime in the middle of the day? Because again, the timing of this and how long we allocate for it to take also has an impact on how well we feel we can manage it. So again, with all of these things in place, actually, when we get to have the conversation, we've done half the work already. We've taken half the hassle and the concern out. Ultimately, though, when you do approach these conversations, a word of counsel that's stood me in good stead over the years, won't go into the details here. Let's assume that anything you record in those conversations, whether it be a written note or video file, whatever it is, always assume that when you're having that conversation, one day in the future, that will be replayed to you in a court of law. Because worst case scenario is people get very upset and very scratchy and very scatty, and they get legals, they get lawyers involved. So you just need to know that you're confident you've not said anything that could be misconstrued. So keep it clean, keep it objective. And again, this is where we now start to move into some of those practices about, once you've set the time, the date, the place, got all those logistics in place. When you go into the conversation, be very clear from the outset. What is the purpose of this difficult discussion? What needs to happen by the end of it? Okay, and keep coming back to that. Keep it focused on the outcome of that conversation. What needs to be achieved at the end? Because this is about you acting as a trustee in the interests of the charity. This is not about you trying to protect friendships. This is about you as a trustee upholding your responsibility to act and protect the interests of the charity. And the charity is bigger than any person within it. Yeah, that's just how it is. But focus on that. Keep coming back to that. Think about how you're going to approach this. And the next slide will come to this in a moment, in terms of how you can think about setting the tone, how you frame the conversations. Recognize that however scared you're feeling, however wibble wobble jelly on a plate your stomach is as you're going into this, that's fine. It's okay. Everyone who has to instigate and lead a difficult discussion, an awkward conversation, feels exactly the same as you. It's just that some of us have had a bit more practice in hiding it and bluffing our way through it. So it's okay to feel those things. Practice, absolutely. Think about your opening arguments. Think about what you're going to say. Find a confidential, trusted colleague who you can sort of sound out and say, this is how I'm thinking of approaching this issue. Can I just ask you? Don't tell them who it is. Don't give them the fine details of it all, because you don't want to prejudice them, but that might help you with nerves as well. Throughout the conversation, think about how you're going to use active listening and active questioning as well. So when the other person says something, make sure that you've understood it properly. Ask them to clarify their point. And ultimately, you're coming into this conversation, this difficult discussion, with an objective. By the end of this, we need to resolve this. This person needs to agree to change or something else. But think about how much wriggle room you're prepared to have within this as well. Because if you come at this saying, this is what's going to happen at the end of it, then the other person says, well, what's the point of me even trying to engage in this conversation with you, this discussion? It's a foregone conclusion. You've already judged and sentenced me. What's the point? So if you're able to show that there's potential for some compromise within that, then the other party, the other people, will be more open to reciprocate that and to say, okay, well, maybe we can look at this a bit differently. Maybe I can think about how I'm doing things, because they see it's a compromised position. Ultimately, this approach and how we go through as well. Now, this chart may be helpful. And it's about thinking about, how do you frame the conversation? What sort of prompts do you use? And in each of the 4 boxes, each of the 4 quadrants, there's an example of how you open up that difficult conversation. And it's here on a kind of a grid matrix for you to try and work out what might be the most appropriate way to set the tone, the feel for this. And that's based on the charity's values, the culture of the charity. It's based on the nature of the issue in hand that you're having to have the conversation around. It's based on the sorts of outcomes that you need to get from it. And it's based on what you think you understand about the other people involved as well. So, for example, it may be that, go back a few minutes into this video, and I gave the example that you may be the chair and some of the trustees have come to you and said, that trustee over there, Bob, Jill, they're always late. We're concerned about them. It's making it difficult. Well, on that basis, there's nothing really bad happening. That trustee has not actually broken any of the rules. They've not actually done anything that's specifically damaging that you can point at, but it is starting to upset other people. It's affecting working relationships. But as a chair, you want to be nurturing. You want to take an informal approach. So in this instance, we'd look at quadrant 3, something which is indirect because it's a quiet word, and it's sensitive because there may be other things going on in that trustee's world and their life that explain it, but they don't feel they want to make public to the other trustees. So you can approach it on that way. Alternatively, it may be that you say, no, you know what, we just got to take a direct approach on this. Something bad has happened. There's something concrete, there's specific complaints, there are hard concerns that have been evidenced. So how do we approach this? And we can either try and be nurturing, or we can be quite blunt and insensitive. Again, part of that is think about what the charity's values are, what its culture is, and think about the sorts of relationships that already exist. And think about what you know about this person. What's going to get through to them? What will they respond well to? And some of that, again, goes back to those earlier points about planning this in advance, practicing it, working it out before you actually do it for real. Phew, okay, so that feels quite exhausting so far, doesn't it? But it doesn't stop there. So there's a difficult conversation to be had. There is some planning we've done about it. We've thought about how we approach it. We've framed it appropriately. We've managed to get through it. Phew, that's it, right? No, doesn't stop there, I'm afraid. After you've had that conversation, and you come out either feeling elated, or more often than not, you just want to find the nearest gin bottle, crawl inside for a few days, a big bag of crisps or cake, just to pull yourself back together and recover. But it doesn't stop there. The follow-up is critical. What you do after that difficult conversation as well is really key, because it enacts and it reinforces the commitment to action, to change, to resolution. And again, so there's some prompts here on this slide, but it will vary what those follow-up actions are according to what the conversation you've had to have is about. As with all things though, it's hard to begin with, but it gets a bit less hard over time. And if you have a clear structure and a process in place that you agree, then your relationships with other people are still there afterwards, or they're protected. Or if there's any concern or slander or complaint made about the way that the conversation, the discussion was handled and conducted, you've got the records to show we did this in the best way possible at the time. So hopefully there's been some things there that have been helpful and of use, of practical use and encouragement to you for those times as a trustee when you recognize there's a difficult discussion, an awkward conversation that has to be had with someone about something, and you really wish someone else would pick it up, but it's probably you who's going to have to do it. That's been a starting point. Again, this is part of a series about how trustees meet together and act together, and the way you actually work out your relationships in practice. We have some other sessions in this theme, which are about how we actually communicate and what we say and what people hear, about how we take decisions. So not just the conversations we have with people, but then in parallel to that, there may be decisions we have to take, which seem impossible. So how do we start to approach those? And then a little bit about the relationships that as trustees you have with paid staff and volunteers, and how to get the balance right with that. So thanks for listening in on this. Hopefully, again, like I say, there's been something of encouragement or practical use. Practicing those is the key thing. Difficult conversations do not get easier over time, or the more you do with them, it just gets less difficult for you to approach. But having a clear structure, planning it out, makes it hopefully a little easier to navigate and work your way through. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in a future session.